You can be visible everywhere now, and still feel psychologically invisible. That's the strange part. These days culture has become obsessed with identity. Labels, visibility, self-expression, pronouns in bios, algorithms sorting personalities into categories that can be understood instantly. But non-binary people often discover something terrifying after finally becoming visible. Visibility does not guarantee perception, and being seen incorrectly for long enough starts changing the way a person experiences themselves. Quietly, because the exhaustion isn't always coming from hatred. Sometimes it comes from constant emotional translation, from watching people almost understand you, almost close enough to sound supportive, close enough to sound progressive, close enough to say the right words, but not close enough to actually perceive you. And the human brain notices that difference immediately. That's why so many non-binary people live with a form of emotional hypervigilance nobody talks about. Not hypervigilance toward danger. Hypervigilance toward interpretation, toward tone shifts, facial reactions, micro-hesitations, social corrections, tiny pauses before pronouns. The way people suddenly reorganize their language around you like they're solving a puzzle instead of meeting a person. That changes people, especially over time, because identity is not only built through self-understanding. It's built through reflected understanding. Humans psychologically stabilize through recognition, not just attention, recognition. There's a difference. Attention notices your existence. Recognition relaxes your nervous system. And many non-binary people rarely experience that relaxation fully. Not because nobody cares, but because modern society still processes identity through emotional shortcuts. Male, female, understandable, predictable, categorized quickly. The brain likes certainty. And non-binary existence interrupts certainty, which means many people unconsciously respond to non-binary individuals with subtle psychological distancing. Not always openly, sometimes emotionally, sometimes linguistically, sometimes through overanalysis. And over time, that creates a devastating emotional contradiction. You become hypervisible while remaining emotionally untranslated. People know the identity label, but still fail to psychologically perceive the person underneath it. That creates a specific kind of loneliness, one that's difficult to explain, because loneliness is usually imagined as physical isolation. But this is different. This is social proximity without psychological arrival. Being included without fully landing anywhere emotionally. And modern digital culture makes this even worse, because online identity systems reward immediate interpretability, quick aesthetics, fast categorization, instant emotional branding. Swipe culture trained people to process human beings like emotional thumbnails. A few traits, a few visuals, a few assumptions, then immediate conclusions. And non-binary people often disrupt that process unintentionally, which creates tension inside environments built around instant readability. That's why so many non-binary people become experts at emotional editing, not always consciously, but strategically, softening certain behaviors, amplifying others, adjusting voice patterns, monitoring clothing choices, controlling body language, rehearsing explanations before conversations even happen. Not because they're fake, because unpredictability stopped feeling emotionally safe. That's the part people misunderstand. Emotional masking is not always about hiding identity. Sometimes it's about reducing social friction. Sometimes it's survival, because existing outside familiar social categories forces people into constant emotional negotiation. And emotional negotiation is exhausting, especially when it never fully ends. Even acceptance can become exhausting, because acceptance is not the same as understanding. A person can intellectually support you, while emotionally perceiving you incorrectly the entire time. That contradiction creates identity fatigue. You start wondering whether anyone actually sees you, or whether they're just trying to be a good person around you. And eventually the brain adapts to that uncertainty. Dangerously, many non-binary people become emotionally overobservant because of this. They monitor conversations constantly, not for validation alone, for confirmation, for signs that perception is slipping again. Because once someone feels repeatedly misperceived, they begin developing emotional presuspicion. They stop entering relationships asking, "Will this person like me?" and start asking, "Will this person eventually reduce me into something simpler?" That fear changes intimacy completely, because intimacy depends on psychological rest. But psychological rest becomes difficult when someone constantly feels emotionally interpreted instead of emotionally understood. So relationships start becoming performances of manageability, not authenticity. You explain yourself carefully, compress complexity, avoid emotional inconvenience, pre-translate your feelings, anticipate confusion before it happens. And eventually, you stop noticing how much of yourself is being edited for other people's comfort. That's one of the darkest psychological effects of chronic misperception. Self-surveillance. You become both the person and the constant observer of the person, monitoring yourself in real time, how you sound, how you move, how masculine, how feminine, how understandable, how acceptable, how exhausting you might become for others. That creates identity fragmentation, because the nervous system cannot relax while constantly managing perception, especially in modern environments where identity has become partially performative. Social media intensified this dramatically. Online, identity often becomes optimized for consumption, not understanding. People learn how to present themselves in emotionally digestible ways because digital culture rewards clarity over complexity. But non-binary experiences often feel fluid, contextual, emotionally layered, difficult to compress into quick explanations. And the internet punishes emotional complexity. Quietly, algorithms reward identities people can process instantly, not identities that require emotional patience. So many non-binary people begin splitting themselves into versions. One version for safety, one for work, one for family, one for dating apps, one for online spaces, one for survival. And eventually the question becomes terrifying. Which version is actually resting? Because survival personalities slowly become automatic. That's how emotional masking evolves from strategy into identity confusion. Not because the identity itself is fake. Because constant perception management destabilizes emotional continuity. You stop feeling fully witnessed anywhere. And modern dating culture amplifies this even more. Because dating apps operate through accelerated emotional assumptions. People decide attraction before understanding, compatibility before conversation, gender expectations before emotional intimacy. which means non-binary people often experience a specific form of romantic exhaustion. Being desired conditionally, desired aesthetically, desired experimentally, desired privately, desired politically, but not always perceived relationally. And that distinction matters psychologically a lot, because being emotionally chosen is different from being emotionally comprehended. One creates excitement, the other creates safety. Modern relationships increasingly prioritize stimulation over perception. That's why so many people feel emotionally consumed without feeling emotionally known. And non-binary individuals often experience this contradiction intensely, especially when partners become attached to fragments, the masculine parts, the feminine parts, the ambiguity itself, the novelty, the aesthetics, but not the full psychological reality underneath. That creates emotional substitution fears. The fear that people are not bonding with you, but with their interpretation of you. And prolonged misinterpretation damages trust slowly. Not dramatic betrayal, something quieter. You begin expecting partial understanding everywhere, which creates emotional distance even inside intimacy. You stop fully relaxing around people, even good people, because repeated emotional misperception trains the nervous system to stay slightly guarded, slightly translated, slightly unfinished. That's why many non-binary people describe feeling emotionally exhausted in ways that are difficult to articulate. Not because they hate themselves, not because they're confused, but because existing inside systems built around rigid interpretation creates chronic psychological tension. Especially when modern society simultaneously encourages visibility and punishes incomprehensibility. That contradiction burns people out. Quietly, people now celebrate identity publicly, while still demanding emotional convenience privately. And emotional convenience is dangerous, because convenience prefers simplicity, predictability, immediate understanding. But human beings are not emotionally simple, especially people forced to examine identity more deeply than most. That deeper examination changes awareness permanently. Many non-binary people become unusually perceptive emotionally because they spend years observing social behavior from partial psychological distance. They notice contradictions faster, performance behavior faster, gender conditioning faster, emotional discomfort faster, because survival required observation, and observation changes people. Especially when belonging feels unstable. That instability can create chronic emotional scanning. You start monitoring rooms automatically. Who feels safe? Who feels performative? Who feels curious? Who feels threatened? Who feels uncomfortable? Who only understands you theoretically? And eventually social interaction becomes mentally exhausting before it even begins. Not because connection is unwanted, because perception feels uncertain. Again, and again, and again. That repetition creates one of the deepest hidden wounds in modern identity psychology. The fear of becoming emotionally unknowable. Not mysterious, unreachable. Like no matter how honestly you communicate, people will still reconstruct you into something easier for themselves to understand. That fear can make vulnerability feel dangerous, because vulnerability only feels safe when someone can emotionally hold complexity without reducing it. Most people struggle with that now. Modern culture trains rapid interpretation, not patient understanding. People consume identities faster than they connect with human beings. That's why so many non-binary people feel emotionally exhausted even in socially progressive spaces. Because language adaptation alone does not automatically create perception. And perception is what the nervous system is actually searching for. Not applause. Not visibility. Not performative support. Recognition. The feeling of finally being psychologically located by another human being. Fully. Without shrinking. Without translating constantly. Without becoming emotionally editable. That's the real hunger underneath all of this. Not attention. Emotional rest. Because the deepest exhaustion comes from never feeling fully perceived long enough to stop monitoring yourself. And eventually, that kind of survival changes the way a person experiences intimacy forever. You stop asking whether people can see you, and start wondering whether anyone is capable of seeing anybody anymore.